I'm Henry Theriault. I'm on the NAASR board and interact with NAASR in other ways, and I am thrilled tonight to be able to introduce our main speaker with a few preliminary, it's been a long day, preliminary remarks. First of all, I did want to call your attention to the somewhat small print on the projected screen. I'm sure you can get this information from other sources, but these are the upcoming events at NAASR. The small print is a good thing because NAASR never sleeps. It's constant. There are things, I mean, you look, this is just into middle of November, and this is all that's going on. So I would call your attention to the UCLA Arts Uprooted Symposium, which does require registration, and also if you see the Armenian literature and translation class, that's Lisa Glisarian, which I can't see right now, but yes, a good friend and excellent professor who will be teaching. So just if those are things you want to do, and I would also call attention to that excellent program that's going to happen at the AGME in Hayastan in next week, which is only excellent. I'm going to be there, so that's very exciting. So, all right, and I do want to thank the Gulbenkian Foundation for their ongoing support of this lecture series on contemporary Armenian issues, and that's especially important. NAASR has gotten such a global reach and so much attention for the programs that it's been doing in recent years that organizations like the Gulbenkian Foundation really partner with NAASR very readily, and it's a tribute to the staff at NAASR, Silva, Marc, Ani, and others, and it's also a tribute to members of the board, and we see many of them here tonight, too many to name, for doing this incredible work over the last few years, and for, I mean, obviously for many, many years, but that has gotten such great attention and expansion. And I think I would ask you to all join me in thanking NAASR board member Joan Collegian for her generous support to the annual Professor Charles B. Garabedian Lecture in memory of her uncle. Professor Charles B. Garabedian, 1917 to 1991, was born in Everett, Mass., and graduated magna cum laude from Everett High School and Tufts University. He attended Harvard Law School and graduated again magna cum laude from Boston University Law School. During World War I, he served in the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA. And in the late 1940s, he began his teaching career at Suffolk University Law School. His expertise was tort litigation and damages, courses which he continuously taught at Suffolk University Law School for over 40 years. At the time of his death, Professor Garabedian was the senior faculty professor at Suffolk University Law School. That's quite an accomplishment. There will be a reception after the program, and you saw some refreshments. And now we come to the reason we're here especially, is a talk by Marc Mamigonian. I'm guessing everybody knows who Marc is, sitting here in the front row. But when I read this, I can't believe you didn't tell me about this stuff, some of the things you've done. This I learned, you're too humble. I mean, we know he's the Director of Academic Affairs of the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, our beloved NAASR, where he's worked since 1998, and those of you will remember his anniversary, 25th anniversary, where he got a lot of fun videos from folks last year. He is co-author, and this is what I didn't know. You didn't tell 2020. You didn't tell me this stuff. Author of the volume Annotations to James Joyce Ulysses, Oxford UP, 2022. With John N. Turner and Sam Sloat, and I need to get a copy of this later tonight, of annotated editions of James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist of a Young Man, Alma Classics 2014 with John N. Turner, and Ulysses, Alma Classics 2015 with Turner and Sloat. And is the editor of the volume The Armenians of New England, Armenian Heritage Press 2004, I did know that. And co-editor with Thomas Kuhne and Mary Jane Rhine of Documenting the Armenian Genocide, Essays in Honor of Taner Akçam, which came out with from Palgrave Macmillan in 2023. I did know about that as well. And some of these other things. He has published articles in Genocide Studies Internationally, which I'm proud to co-edit, and James Joyce Quarterly, the Armenian Review, the Journal of the Society for Armenian Studies, and elsewhere, including the chapter Weaponizing the First Amendment, Denial of the Armenian Genocide and the U.S. Courts in Denial of the Genocides in the 21st Century, University of Nebraska Press, 2023, edited by someone probably familiar to you as well, Professor Bedros Dermatosian from the University of Nebraska. And I just have to add, Marc is a special inspiration to me, coming as he has from the debilitating town of Dover, New Hampshire, and rising to these great levels of achievement in his career, overcoming very humble background, wishing he could have grown up in Rochester near me, but, you know, he does what he can. Without further ado, let's welcome Marc Mamigonian, one of the truly, I mean, honestly, great human beings that we'll ever meet. Good luck, Marc. Looking forward to it.
Well, the evening isn't a complete loss because Henry learned something. So I consider it a victory already. So thank you so much, Henry, and thank you all for being here. Let me get my settings set. Thank you for the kindness, Henry. And I also want to thank my NAASR colleagues, Silva, Ani, and Paige for their assistance in all matters, and Michelle and Miles generally for everything and for being here. I want to also reiterate NAASR's and my gratitude to the Kalus Gulbenkian Foundation for their support for the contemporary issues programs that are ongoing, and even more so to Joan Collegian for her support. It's really an honor for me to give this talk in memory of her uncle, Professor Garabedian, and I want to extend a special thank you to NAASR's academic director for choosing me when he had so many better qualified speakers to select among. Let me just add a reminder that we will have Q&A after I finish, and that Zoom participants can send questions using the Zoom Q&A, and those of you in the room, I would ask you, if you are able, please, to wander up to the microphone so that we can hear you and the world can hear you as well, because otherwise the world can't hear you, and the world wants to hear you. Let me begin. Gaslighting the World, How Azerbaijan Falsifies History and Denies Armenian Existence. For better or for worse, I've spent a considerable part of the past quarter century looking into, writing about the denial efforts of the Republic of Turkey and its supporters, aimed at negating, or in a multitude of different ways, undermining the facts around the Armenian genocide and their acceptance as facts in the political, academic, and public realms. There are, I am told, more enjoyable ways to spend your time, but there you have it. Like many of us, I was slow to take heed of the seriousness of the similar and at times interrelated efforts of Azerbaijan and its supporters to generate counterfactual narratives not only about the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, but also indeed about the entire history of the region, narratives in which Armenia effectively ceases to exist. The two phenomena, again, are, of course, interrelated. If it is the case that Turkey is relatively less extreme nowadays, and I underscore both the words if and relatively, nevertheless, its official denialist stance remains unchanged, and its efforts to push its narratives in academic, journalistic, and think tank circles are undiminished. It may seem to us that official U.S. recognition of the Armenian genocide in the face of Turkey's opposition marked some sort of culmination of the struggle against denial, and I don't wish to suggest that it wasn't, or that it wasn't important, but we ought not to delude ourselves into thinking that it actually ended anything. Similarly, while destruction of Armenian monuments in Turkey may not be as systematic as it once was, it is nevertheless still endemic and ongoing. And I would point you to, among other places, a recent article on the left-hand side of the screen by George Akjayan in the Armenian Weekly, and of course the reporting in Hyperallergic on Azerbaijan's destruction. Turkey's protege state, Azerbaijan, has emulated its big brother, Orwellian double entendre intended, expunging the region of Nakhchivan of all evidence of Armenian existence, threatening Artsakh with annihilation, and then ethnically cleansing Armenians from Artsakh while destroying evidence of Armenians' presence in the region and laying claim to the Republic of Armenia itself as Western Azerbaijan. Turkey and Azerbaijan are often aided and abetted in their contrafactual efforts by people who call themselves scholars, journalists, and policy analysts, who sometimes knowingly, sometimes ignorantly, repeat the denialist assertions that emanate from those states, legitimizing and spreading them further. As Bedros Dermatosian has written, quote, "Denialists of the Armenian genocide are not part of the past. They are still very active in contemporary academic circles. In addition to being preoccupied with their futile efforts at the dissemination of misknowledge about the Armenian genocide, they are also currently embarking on new projects to write a revisionist history that denies the historical ties of Armenians to the land of Karabakh and undermines their quest for self-determination," unquote. It is no coincidence, in other words, that those who deny the reality of the Armenian genocide also deny other historical realities elsewhere. Azerbaijan's goals are roughly the same as those of Turkey. Ideally, they want their own fake historical narratives to be accepted as factual. But even if that does not happen, it's still possible and useful for their historical fabrications to be recognized by third parties as one of the competing narratives in a region fraught with ancient, deep-seated ethnic hatreds that can only be untangled by enlightened Westerners. Turkey and Azerbaijan have forged a strong strategic partnership embodied in the catchphrase, "One nation, two states," a catchphrase which emanates, I would hasten to point out, from Turkey and Azerbaijan, not from Armenia, and was enacted in the Turkish-facilitated 44-day war in 2020. And when I say facilitated, that is not really an adequate word for Turkey's indispensable role in that war. And this is not to forget, by the way, the contribution of other states, including Russia, Ukraine, and Israel, in providing advanced weapons for Azerbaijan. Actually, in one of the rare visible signs of conflict in the Turkey-Azerbaijan fraternal relationship, Turkish President Erdogan's public statements taking credit for the hands-on role played by the Turkish military in the 2020 war have ruffled feathers in Baku, prompting the Azeri Defense Ministry to assert that, quote, "there is no basis for claims regarding the involvement of any country's military personnel in the battles for Azerbaijan's territorial integrity and sovereignty." Azerbaijan would appear to be exceedingly sensitive to any suggestion that its victory was anything less than the product of its own prowess. Terminology. A few words about terminology. I regularly use the word denial to characterize Azerbaijan's rhetoric about Armenia and Armenians, although their war on facts is not limited to Armenian matters, since it's in many ways similar to, if not an outgrowth of, Turkey's denial of the Armenian genocide. As with Turkey's denial, I'm less interested in how Azerbaijan offers fictions within its own borders, which is not to say this is an unimportant topic. Rather, I'm more interested in how it exports them. In the title of my talk, I've used the term gaslighting. Partly, I confess, this is a stylistic flourish to play on Azerbaijan's fossil fuel-driven autocracy. But partly, too, it is to create the opportunity, maybe, I hope, for different ways of viewing what Azerbaijan is doing and what its effects are. So I want to talk a little about the concept of gaslighting before proceeding. The term derives from the title of the 1944 MGM movie Gaslight, directed by George Cukor and starring Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer. This was itself a remake of a noteworthy 1940 British film of the same name. The British film was, in turn, an adaptation of a play by Patrick Hamilton that premiered in London's West End in 1938 and also had a successful run in the US later under the title Angel Street. What is common to all three works is the basic plot, which hinges on the efforts of a husband to manipulate his wife into believing herself insane so that she can be removed from the scene for reasons which I will not disclose to you because I don't want to spoil the ending for you. Maybe some of you have seen it. Maybe many of you have seen it. It's worth seeing. Both the British film and the American film were highly successful and acclaimed, especially the 1944 American version, for which Ingrid Bergman won an Oscar for her poignant portrayal of a woman driven to the edge of insanity. I'd like to show you a couple of illustrative scenes, but using copyrighted material will get this talk flagged on YouTube, and I'm not going to do that. So you can find clips online, or better yet, sit down and watch the whole movie. Gaslighting is not a new term, but it has gained wider recognition in recent years as a concept. And special note should be taken of a book published just this year called On Gaslighting by Kate Abramson. But the Oxford English Dictionary dates the first use of gaslight as a verb to the early 1960s, and in 2018 it was a runner-up for the OED's Word of the Year. I don't know what word won. I'm afraid I didn't take note of that. Anyway, for Abramson, quote, gaslighting is best understood as a form of interpersonal interaction. To put it a bit starkly, people gaslight, social structures don't. She explains that, quote, the gaslighter is both trying to make the target think she's crazy and actually trying to drive her crazy. And gaslighting is, quote, aimed at radically undermining a person's ability to engage with the world reasonably and in psychologically healthy ways. The process is, quote, horribly wrong, immoral, unethical, vicious, and is a kind of torture that, quote, is accomplished through manipulative means that leave its target rightly sensing in the aftermath that she has been turned against herself. Gaslighting, then, is contingent on a discrepancy of power between the gaslighter and the victim. That is, the gaslighter abuses his position of power to inflict harm on the more vulnerable victim. In this sense, my use of the term is somewhat loose. Azerbaijan can deceive, but it cannot exactly gaslight the world. It can, however, given the current power dynamic, gaslight Armenia and Armenians. It's obvious that since the 44-day war, Azerbaijan is in a place of superior strength vis-a-vis Armenia. As such, it is unsurprising that Azerbaijan seeks to exert its will and to dictate the terms of the peace. Are there ways, then, in which Azerbaijan is seeking to terrorize Armenia or Armenia's leadership into questioning its grip on reality in the same way, and thereby further weaken it in ways that recall the abusive husband in Gaslight? I think perhaps so. Are there ways in which the Armenian government has assumed the character of the wife who begins to doubt herself and the reality of her senses in the face of ceaseless manipulation, made to confess to things that she did not do? Perhaps. If you've seen the film, I'm referring to the American version primarily, as it's the one I know best, you will remember that there's a definite element of sadism involved. The Charles Boyer character seems to relish the systematic mental destruction of his wife, the Ingrid Bergman character. There is a performative aspect to the psychological torture, and I believe this is in some ways the case with Azerbaijan as well. Let me move on. I want to call attention to a rather recent event. In July of this year, Ilham Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, which ranks 164th out of 180 countries in terms of press freedom, a country in which, according to Reporters Without Borders, quote, virtually the entire media sector is under official control and state-owned television is the most popular information source. No independent television or radio is transmitted from within the country, and all print newspapers with a critical stance have been shut down. In a country which has one of the lowest general freedom rankings in the world, according to Freedom House, this Azerbaijan, led by this dictator hosted a global media forum entitled, quote, "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength." Not really, no. It was called, with similar Orwellian overtones, "Exposing False News, Combating Disinformation," and was held in Shushi in Nagorno-Karabakh, no less. I was going to show video, but I decided I'm not going to torture you. I am going to read an excerpt from Aliyev's remarks, which set the tone for the program. He said, quote, "Unfortunately, our country is actually the subject of what is today a top topic of discussion, and it's already, unfortunately, become a part of our life. Sometimes we're surprised when information about Azerbaijan in international media is true. False information, disinformation, manipulation of facts, and false narratives are all things we have faced for many, many years. There are different reasons for that. One of them, of course, was the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan and the mobilization of all the Armenian diaspora structures and pro-Armenian politicians and media representatives in attacking Azerbaijan, creating false narratives and trying to present Azerbaijan as completely different from what it was and what it is." Unquote. We're familiar by now with the demonization of the Armenian diaspora and invocations of its vast power from decades of exposure to Turkey's rhetoric, Turkey, which has consistently tried to assert that the Armenian diaspora wields such influence that Turkey, a NATO member and regional power with the 8th largest military in the world and a list of politicians, diplomats, defense contractors, and CEOs of multinational corporations at its beck and call, is helpless against the powerful Armenian diaspora. Azerbaijan makes essentially the same argument. We know it is untrue. They know it is untrue. They know that we know it is untrue, but it is done for a purpose. What then, I'm one slide behind, it appears. You've heard that anyway. What then is Aliyev's performance, for I think there is no other word for it, meant to convey? I think that the entire production, complete with unctuous Euro host and sycophantic hand-selected journalists lobbing softball questions, is meant to proclaim loudly that Aliyev and his regime are impervious to criticism, that they are powerful, that they are victorious. And yet, like many another autocrat's staged spectacles, what comes through most clearly is not strength, but rather what Stefan Astorian terms Azerbaijan's, quote, state-sponsored narrative of victimization. Everyone is out to get poor Azerbaijan. Armenians, of course, but also the media. Aliyev complained, quote, "Today we see that even the American president is facing what we've been facing for so many years." He does not mean Joe Biden. "President Trump was the one who named the Washington Post and the New York Times as fake news," he continued. I completely agree with him, not only in this, but in many other statements. How fortuitous that Aliyev is not subject to such criticism from the media in Azerbaijan, which, again, is almost entirely controlled by the state, a scenario that Trump may look upon with envy. If you're wondering what happened to the protester in this photograph next, it's exactly what you think. What happened after this picture, God only knows. In some respects, what Aliyev is engaged in moves beyond denial, beyond mere lies. Watching his performance at the Bizarro World Media Forum, one senses someone so besotted by his own power that he has moved beyond even making token gestures towards factuality. So perhaps there may be other terms for what Azerbaijan is attempting, other frameworks in which it can be understood. The late philosopher Harry Frankfurt, long of Princeton University, who, according to his Princeton obituary, made major contributions to the study of Descartes and Hume and specialized in foundational questions in metaphysics, epistemology, moral philosophy, philosophical anthropology, political philosophy, and religion, was better known, or best known, outside of philosophy departments for a small book he published in 2005. The name of his book is On Bullshit. Frankfurt writes, quote, telling a lie is an act with a sharp focus. The liar is inescapably concerned with truth values. In order to invent a lie at all, he must think he knows what is true. And in order to invent an effective lie, he must design his falsehood under the guidance of that truth. On the other hand, a person who undertakes to bullshit his way through has much more freedom. His focus is panoramic rather than particular. He does not limit himself to inserting a certain falsehood at a specific point, and thus is not constrained by the truths surrounding that point or intersecting it. He is prepared to fake the context as well, so far as need requires. He does not care whether the things he says describe reality correctly. He just picks them out or makes them up to suit his purpose. Now, there are reasons, which perhaps I need not elaborate, why the title of my talk is Gaslighting the World rather than Bullshitting the World. And in invoking Frankfurt's work, I'm not in any way trying to be facetious. As his Princeton obituary noted, quote, in spite of its amusing title, it was a quite serious essay deeply concerned with the nature of truth. I would agree, and I would not want to suggest that Azerbaijan's rhetoric is not to be taken seriously. Quite the contrary. It's here that I would like to take a short detour into a discussion of the interesting relationship between Azerbaijani national identity and historical truth, since this has shaped the current climate strongly. A full discussion of this very interesting and important topic is beyond the scope of what will already be probably a too long talk. And important aspects of it were explored in the 2022 UCLA conference, Is the Pen Mightier Than the Sword? And in the 2023 publication Monuments and Identities in the Caucasus, edited by Igor Dorfman-Lazarev and Harutun Kachadurian, in the volume Caucasian Albania, an International Handbook, edited by Jos Gippert and Yasmin Dumtraget, in Harun Yilmaz's National Identities in Soviet Historiography, and in Victor Schnirelman's The Value of the Past, among other places, all of which are worth your seeking out. I think the analysis and discussion provided by Stefan Asturian in his chapter in Monuments and Identities in the Caucasus is particularly useful and cogent. Whereas Georgia and Armenia have ancient national churches, a large body of historical texts dating back to the early centuries of the Christian or Common Era, and centuries-long existences as collective entities, or ethne or ethnoses, depending on what word you like to use, Asturian writes that, quote, the Azerbaijani sense of nationhood is fragile. It combines the image of the Armenian enemy with a narrative of victimization to forge a national identity. And importantly, the Azerbaijani anti-Armenian outlook led to a process of mirroring the Armenian experience. Asturian, as others have noted, points out that Azerbaijani national consciousness is a recent phenomenon, and it was in Soviet times and as a result of Soviet policies that Azerbaijani national identity coalesced. Now, the fact that Azerbaijan is a new nation and Armenia and Georgia, to say nothing of Iran, are old ones, is not a value judgment. But in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, it posed a kind of existential problem because of Stalin's doctrine of nationalities, wherein each of the constitutive Soviet republics or nations had to have a distinctive national history, national culture, and autochthonous origins for the privileged titular nation. Autochthonous, meaning original, literally, of the earth, of the soil. And for those republics whose titular nationality, such as Azerbaijan, did not have an ancient history dating from time out of mind in the current lands in which they lived, well, such a history would simply have to be invented, and so it was. This isn't Azerbaijan's fault. It's just the way it was. But one can speculate on the psychological dynamic among the three Transcaucasian states seen here on this map, who were not born equipped with, to borrow a contemporary term, comparable origin stories. For political reasons, the kinship between Azerbaijan and Turkey had to be eliminated from this history because of the need to shield Azerbaijan from pan-Turkism. One nation, two states would not fly in Soviet times. And at any rate, the Azeris needed to be shown as the original, primordial inhabitants of Azerbaijan, not medieval arrivals. Dorfman-Lazarev explains that, quote, The imprisonment and killing of numerous intellectuals of Azerbaijan by Soviet authorities between 1936 and 1938 facilitated the creation of a new fantasist historiographic doctrine, disconnected from the former historiographical tradition and from any objective analysis of historical sources. The lasting stamp of the violence unleashed against Azerbaijan's intelligentsia has left on the cultural life of the country can hardly be overestimated. To greatly oversimplify a lot of complicated material, a new official history promulgated in 1939 traced Azerbaijan's ethnogenesis to the Medes, the Caspians, and the Caucasian Albanians. As Dorfman Lazarov writes, this approach enabled the Azerbaijani historiographers to establish an uninterrupted continuity between the civilizations of late antiquity in the South Caucasus and the present-day Turcophone population of Azerbaijan, leaving the Armenians outside the picture. Later, in the 1960s, one of the editors of the 1939 history or pseudo-history, named Zelik Yampolsky, shifted the focus to the Caucasian Albanians. It doesn't take a great deal of imagination to see that from the 1930s on, Azerbaijani history became something to be fabricated to serve the needs of the present. And it created a framework which would be further exploited by the rather shameless Zia Bunyatov and his acolytes, whose efforts to refashion history were rather crude, but not necessarily, therefore, ineffective. As the late George Bernutian wrote, during the 1980s and 1990s, that is, since the recent political and military conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, many new editions of these early translations of primary sources have been published by the Academy of Sciences of Azerbaijan, or by other state-sponsored publishers, in which most references to Armenia and the Armenians have been altered or deleted. If you ever attended any of George Bernutian's lectures, including this one, you can probably hear his voice in your head saying this. Bernutian was surely correct in his assessment that, quote, such blatant tampering with primary source material strikes at the very heart of scholarly integrity, although it might be argued that his warning that, quote, the international community must not allow such breaches of intellectual honesty to go unnoticed and uncensored, surely, for the most part, fell on deaf ears. However, I do want to point out the contributions of some, including Ruben Galician and his publications, such as The Invention of History, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the Showcasing of Imagination, to documenting this phenomenon, as well as the work of Victor Schnirelman, and more recently, Sarah Krombach, whose 2019 University of Amsterdam PhD thesis, Zia Bunyatov and the Invention of an Azerbaijani Past, is extremely valuable. The seriousness of the problem was made clear, again by Bernutian, when Bunyatov's distortions as well as other misrepresentations found their way into the work of American scholar Audrey Altstadt's book, The Azerbaijani Turks, Power and Identity Under Russian Rule, 1992. Bernutian writes that Altstadt, quote, without making an effort to verify unsubstantiated Azerbaijani claims, accepts almost all these assertions and even resorts to additional distortions to further enhance Azerbaijani claims. Nevertheless, some 25 years later, Lawrence Broers, in a review of one of Altstadt's later publications, called The Azerbaijani Turks, quote, a landmark study. Time heals all wounds. Although Azerbaijan's push to advance its historical distortions has never stopped, it became more visible at particular moments in time, such as the 2005 destruction of the Khachkars of Juga. I'd like to pause a moment to look at this, as it allows an unusually direct view into the heart of darkness, so to speak. We know that in 2005, 2006, Azerbaijan completed the destruction of what were once thousands of Khachkars in Juga, just across the border between Azerbaijan and Iran. And that orgy of cultural vandalism was the final act in a longer drama that saw the complete destruction of all evidence of our centuries of Armenian existence in Nakhchivan. I would refer anyone who wishes to read more to the many works of Argham Ayvazyan, to the recent important work of Simon Mahakian and Sarah Pickman, and the invaluable work of RAA, Research on Armenian Architecture, as well as the meticulous documentation done by Caucasus Heritage Watch which shows that at least 98% of all Armenian cultural sites in Nakhchivan have been eliminated, a remarkable achievement in the annals of cultural genocide. What is noteworthy, other than the destruction itself, is Azerbaijan's overdetermined insistence that there never were Armenians, and thus never were Armenian churches or graves in Nakhchivan, and that therefore what we regard as the rich heritage of Armenian monuments could only, in fact, have been Caucasian Albanian. On the other hand, if they were Caucasian Albanian, one wonders why they had to be eradicated, especially if they never existed in the first place. We are deep into Freud country here, and we can plainly see at work what Derrida termed kettle logic. The reference is to a joke recorded by Freud in his 1905 study, Wit and Its Relation to the Unconscious. It goes as follows. A had borrowed a copper kettle from B, and upon returning it was sued by B because it had a large hole, which rendered it unserviceable. His defense was this. In the first place, I never borrowed any kettle from B. Secondly, the kettle had a hole in it when I received it. Thirdly, the kettle was in perfect condition when I returned it. You see the problem, I think. What about those Western scholars and journalists who help advance these narratives? I would like to discuss some examples from recent years. Before doing so, I would like to make clear that in approaching this subject, I'm neither suggesting that all academic production about Azerbaijan or about Azerbaijanis should be regarded as necessarily trafficking in distortions or historical denial. However, I do think that scholars and journalists who participate in state-orchestrated productions, such as the aforementioned Global Media Forum of this past summer, or this 2021 spectacle, New Vision for the South Caucasus, Post-Conflict Development and Cooperation, attended by numerous scholars from around the world, insert your own scare quotes, are thereby part of the reputation laundering of one of the world's worst governments and deserve to be held accountable for their actions. Personally, I can see no defense for it. Arguably, the poster child for this kind of academic malfeasance, at least since the 1990s, is Dr. Brenda Schaefer, who was associated with prestigious universities including Harvard, Georgetown, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, as well as think tanks, including the Atlantic Council and the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which sounds like such a nice organization. At Harvard, she served as the head of the Caspian Studies program at the Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, a program that happily no longer exists. According to an in-depth article from the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, OCCRP, whose massive documentation of Azerbaijani corruption is beyond invaluable, the Caspian Studies program was set up in 1999 through a $1 million grant from the U.S. Azerbaijan Chamber of Commerce and a consortium of oil and gas companies led by Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron. This, then, is as good a time as any for a short digression concerning the U.S. Azerbaijan Chamber of Commerce. The U.S. Azerbaijan Chamber of Commerce was founded in 1995 by longtime Republican power broker James Baker III, who served as White House Chief of Staff and United States Secretary of the Treasury under President Ronald Reagan, and as Secretary of State and White House Chief of Staff under George H.W. Bush, among other things. The Chamber of Commerce calls itself, quote, the premier conduit for improved business and commercial ties between the two countries, and there's little reason to think that this is hyperbole. It boasts that it, quote, was a key driving force between two of the world's most strategic and ambitious regional energy projects, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline and the Baku-Tbilisi-Erzurum gas pipeline. And again, I have no reason to doubt them. Its honorary council of advisors formerly included Henry Kissinger and currently includes Baker and former White House Chief of Staff and ex-governor of New Hampshire, John Sununu, whose family retains close ties to Azerbaijan. Other former advisors include Richard Armitage and Dick Cheney. Its board of directors includes representatives of British Petroleum and Boeing, and its board of trustees includes the ambassador of the Republic of Azerbaijan to the United States, the deputy foreign minister of foreign affairs, veteran neoconservative hawk Richard Pearl, as well as His Excellency Ilham Aliyev, the president of the Republic of Azerbaijan. Quote, a prominent statesman and visionary leader with a distinguished track record in public service, as he is described on its website. There's no need to belabor the influence wielded by such political power brokers and corporate giants, nor the fact that there's very little business in Azerbaijan that is not either directly or indirectly controlled by the Aliyev and Pashayev families and their cronies, including SOCAR, the state oil company of Azerbaijan, of which Ilham Aliyev is himself the former vice president. For years, Brenda Schaefer produced Azerbaijan-friendly and occasionally Armenia-unfriendly op-eds and other materials, always presenting her academic affiliations as her calling card. It was not until 2014 that journalist Robert Colson revealed that Schaefer had not only run a center funded by and serving the interests of the U.S.-Azerbaijan Chamber of Commerce and the petrodollars behind it, but also that she had been an advisor to SOCAR itself, again, which is the Azerbaijani state-owned oil company. Following this revelation, in October 2014, a Columbia graduate student named Casey Mitchell challenged Schaefer on these issues at an event at Columbia. She refused to answer him, saying that, quote, part of the American way is a right to privacy. Recently, Mitchell featured this incident as well as other examples of the efforts of Azerbaijan to influence American politics in ways that are problematic in his publication Foreign Agents: How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World, a book I highly recommend. Brenda Schaefer is not an isolated case, nor is it a uniquely American problem. There seems little doubt that Azerbaijan, emboldened by its military victory and fueled by petrodollars, will increasingly seek to purchase the kind of academic semi-credibility that Turkey has for years sought through the cultivation of scholars willing to present its state narrative as historical fact, or as at least worthy of consideration as such. Even before the war, the 2018 establishment of at the University of Oxford of the Nizami Ganjavi Center through a mysterious £10 million donation from an entity called the British Foundation for the Study of Azerbaijan and the Caucasus, a UK-based foundation with intimate ties to the sister-in-law of Azerbaijan's dictator Ilham Aliyev, was an indication that Azerbaijan recognized the value of investing in scholarship that reflects favorably on a state hungry for legitimacy, a process otherwise known as reputation laundering. A 2021 Times Higher Education report on the Ganjavi Center contained numerous revelations that raised concerns that the center may be less than purely academic, and emphasized the central role played by Nargiz Pashayeva, Ilham Aliyev's sister-in-law, in brokering the deal that brought the money. The claim of an unnamed Oxford spokesman quoted in the article that the university was made aware of the original source of funds for this gift, which does not come from a government, is far from reassuring in light of the skill with which Azerbaijan's rulers have hidden the origin of the wealth they have spread around the United Kingdom, as has been extensively documented and reported. Last year, Cherwell, Oxford University's independent student newspaper, probed further into the situation, providing more information on the apparent acknowledgement made by Pashayeva of the financial support of Azeri oligarch Iskander Khalilov. However, quote, Cherwell's further inquiries into Khalilov as the potential anonymous donor were inconclusive, and a Freedom of Information Act request to the university to disclose the name was rejected. Similarly, Open Democracy filed a Freedom of Information request that Oxford disclosed the identity of the donor, but in July of this year, a judge ruled that the university was not required to do so. So the sources of the money remain unknown and open to speculation. Back in the USA, in 2022, there appeared the volume, The Nagorno-Karabakh Conflict, Historical and Political Perspectives, edited by M. Hakan Yavuz and Michael M. Gunter. I lack the time to offer a lengthy discussion of the contributions of Yavuz and Gunter to the denial of the Armenian genocide. I've already done so elsewhere, as have others. Suffice it to say they have long been in the forefront of efforts to conjure an academic controversy about the events of 1915. It is this background, rather than any training in or expertise on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, that appears to have placed them in a position to extend their reach to editing a volume on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, or rather now two. In 2023, the same duo published the Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Causes and Consequences. One has to admire their productivity, if nothing else. It will be the task of other writers and reviewers to unpack the historical distortions larded into these books. For the purpose of this discussion, it's going to have to be enough to note that the book's primary task of presenting an account of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict that aligns with Baku's preferred narrative is fully compatible with the long-standing efforts of the editors to cast all possible doubt on the Armenian genocide, and the whole thing comes together in a beautiful, synergistic way in these volumes. Please note my sarcasm. For nearly 2 decades, owing to the efforts of Professor Yavuz, the University of Utah has been associated with genocide-denying, dictator-friendly, fact-allergic pseudo-scholarship on a variety of Armenian-related topics, from the Armenian genocide to the 2020 Artsakh War. This is par for the course in the state-controlled historiography in Ankara and in Baku, but it is startling from an otherwise respectable flagship institution of higher learning in an American state. The most recent manifestation involved a workshop held at the university in honor of Heydar Aliyev, the former high-ranking KGB official and first secretary of the Communist Party of Azerbaijan, who became the 3rd president of Azerbaijan after a military coup removed the democratically elected president. Aliyev reestablished a dictatorial police state that was passed into the hands of his son, Ilham. The November 28, 2023 workshop at Utah, titled with fulsome obsequiousness, Heydar Aliyev 100, the founder of modern Azerbaijan, organized by the Turkish Studies Project at the University of Utah, led by Yavuz, was one of numerous events promoted by Azerbaijan in 2023 to mark the centenary of the man who was rightly seen as the progenitor of the post-Soviet petrodictatorship. A workshop at a respected university celebrating the legacy of a man who set Azerbaijan on a kleptocratic path, which has been even more richly exploited by his son, ought to be a sufficient source of embarrassment for the university, but seemingly it is not. In addition, subsequent reporting by Paul Vartan Sukiasian on CivilNet online has revealed that a report on the workshop that was published on Azertak, the official news agency of the Republic of Azerbaijan, contained invented quotes from some of the participants. According to Sukiasian's reporting, in which Azertak is itself quoted, quote, "It is clear from the press release that was sent to them that the author of the report is Ivo Wasilewska and the editor is M. Yavuz," unquote. The news agency helpfully published screenshots of the properties of the file they received, and they published this. According to her faculty page, Wasilewska is associate professor in the University of Utah's Middle East Studies program. Her curriculum vitae indicates that her research interests are twofold: Middle East and Central Asia, and laughter and humor. One wonders in which category the account of the Aliyev event, of which she is alleged to be the author, should be placed. 2 of the participants were Professor Stephen Lobel and Professor Marjorie Castle of Utah's Political Science Department. Lobel complained to Azertak that words attributed to him were made up. Castle told Sukiasian that she, quote, "did not say anything even close to what she is reported to have said." While one can be sympathetic to these professors who have been misrepresented, allegedly by their own Utah colleagues, it is difficult to imagine what kind of event they thought they were participating in. They've been at Utah since 2004 and 2008, respectively, and really have no good excuse to be unfamiliar with their colleague Yavuz's track record. On the other hand, in the same report, we were told about Michael M. Gunter's paper titled, quote, "Political Leadership, Understanding Heydar Aliyev Through Insights from Charles de Gaulle and Abraham Lincoln." Surely, you might say, even Michael Gunter is not so craven as to present such a paper. This must be invented. But no. As Milton wrote, there is in the lowest deep a lower deep, and Gunter affirmed to Sukiasian that he had been represented accurately. So score 1 for journalism. I'd like to acknowledge also, with gratitude and respect, another recent article by Sukiasian, who's doing a bang-up job on CivilNet, which involves not an academic institution playing footsie with Azerbaijan, but perhaps even more egregiously, a human rights organization. Less than a month ago, Sukiasian reported that RFK Human Rights partners with and RFK Human Rights President Kerry Kennedy, daughter of Robert Kennedy, sits on the board of directors of the Nizami Ganjavi International Center in Baku, not to be confused with the Utah Center, but with the same name, which receives the majority of its funding from the Azeri government. Kennedy can be seen here standing alongside Ilham Aliyev at the 2024 Baku Global Forum, which was titled, with Azerbaijan's unerring eye for the Orwellian, quote, "Fixing the Fractured World." According to RFK Human Rights website, they work, quote, "to ensure freedom of civic activism, hold leaders accountable, and speak truth to power," unquote, but apparently not in Baku. So, what effect does all this have? Well, for one thing, it contributes mightily to the both sides-ism that may have reached its apotheosis in the reporting of Carlotta Gall in the New York Times in 2020. Masterpieces of he said, she said journalism in which little, if any, effort was made to separate claims from facts. It normalizes a worldview in which the competing narratives of Armenians and Azerbaijanis exist around what are, in reality, established facts. For example, in a 2021 essay in the London Review of Books titled "Each Rock Has Two Names," author, and I apologize, I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, Ghaith Abdullahad, engaged in overly familiar, tenuous arguments and false equivalences about the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. He writes that, quote, in both Armenia and Azerbaijan, writers constructed an ethno-national narrative that aspired to negate the existence of the other country, or at least to assign it the role of newcomer in the region. The comparison and the equation that it suggests is fundamentally flawed. While some historians in Armenia undoubtedly have written problematic ethno-national narratives which warrant criticism, they have not, for example, systematically expunged references to Azerbaijan and Azerbaijanis from published historical sources, in stark contrast with Azerbaijani academicians who have excised Armenia and Armenians from such publications for decades, as well as, at the same time as, thousands of Armenian historical monuments have been destroyed within Azerbaijan. If there are ethno-national narratives in Armenia, there also exists a robust countervailing historiography. The same cannot be said for Azerbaijan. Presumably by way of advancing this critique, Abdullahad states that, quote, Armenian writers pointed to Armenian churches and monasteries in Karabakh as proof of uninterrupted presence in the area, and dismissed the term Azerbaijan as a modern political label. But it's not only Armenian writers who have noted the ancient and uninterrupted Armenian presence in the area. It is not an ethno-national assertion, nor an opinion. It is simply a fact of which any historian or expert on the region must surely be aware. Similarly, the use of the name Azerbaijan for the area comprising the current-day state of that name is, in fact, a modern political label. Period. Doesn't mean, anyway, it's just simply a fact. While Abdullahad rightly identifies as specious the preposterous fiction of Azerbaijani historians that modern Armenians, quote, had erased ancient inscriptions and claimed monuments as their own, unquote, the unwarranted conclusion he draws is to shake his head in wonder that, quote, two peoples could look at the same building and each see in it what they wanted to see. There's a difference between Armenians or non-Armenians looking at, say, Ganzasar Cathedral and identifying it as an Armenian church, which is in fact what it is, on the one hand, and Azerbaijani assertions that it is actually a Caucasian Albanian and thus Proto-Azerbaijani building. Equating these two positions is an absurdity, and it suggests that the person making the equation is either incapable of or unwilling to distinguish history from state propaganda, or that his vision has been blurred by the effects of gaslighting. He is right, Abdullahad to look critically at how facts are used to advance various political and perhaps nationalistic agendas, be they Armenian or Azerbaijani. But at key moments, he fails to differentiate fact from fiction, while doing so, presumably, out of a desire to present a balanced picture. Similarly, in another piece, also in the London Review of Books 1 year ago, I subscribed, Tom Stevenson wrote about the violent expulsion of more than 100,000 Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh just prior to the publication of the article. Stevenson blandly states that, quote, Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh were unconvinced that their rights would be protected under Baku's constitutions if they remained in Karabakh. But it is, of course, not only those Armenians who were unconvinced. Any sane observer of the situation in Azerbaijan, with its appalling human rights record, would be unconvinced. There are no rights in Azerbaijan, neither for Azeris nor for Armenians. Inevitably, Stephen mentions Armenia and Azerbaijan having, quote, competing historical accounts going back to the Russo-Persian Wars or even further, unquote. Again, the equation of Armenian and Azerbaijani historical accounts is a gross distortion. The ancient history and culture of Armenia in the region, including Karabakh, are voluminously attested both in Armenian and in non-Armenian histories dating back many centuries. Quote, the ugliness of Azerbaijan's present actions are clear enough, Stevenson writes, but they are not clear enough. They require much more clarity than Stevenson brings in his article. Those reading the London Review of Books got no clarity. Instead, they got a selective presentation of facts supporting a both sides are in the wrong moral that perhaps is comforting to much of Stevenson's audience. The review published a redacted, toned-down version of my letter to the editor, which is something, but it is not a substitute for getting things right in the first place. I'm almost done. A recent scholarly article by Arslan Saparov, entitled Normalizing Conflict, Concealing Genocide, Expert Neutrality in the Armenian-Azerbaijani Conflict, is an important examination of, quote, the phenomenon of academic neutrality, which became a popular stance among some commentators on the matters of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. Saparov argues that this so-called neutrality could have sinister implications unforeseen, perhaps, by its practitioners. I just received this article a couple of weeks ago. I've only had time to read it once and to incorporate a few things into this talk. It's well worth seeking out. Examining think tank expert publications by the likes of Lawrence Browers and Thomas DeWall, Saparov looks at, quote, what is included in the text. In other words, what facts are being used to shape the narrative and how the authors achieve neutrality in the text, as well as, quote, the silences in the text and what facts and contexts are excluded. He concludes in part, what is being concealed by the neutral observers is that there will be no Armenians in Karabakh under Azerbaijani rule. After the 2020 war, Armenians were ethnically cleansed from all the territories that came under Azerbaijani control. The Armenian historical heritage has been methodically destroyed for decades in Azerbaijan, and the same fate befell the Armenian cultural heritage on the territories captured by Azerbaijan in Karabakh. Clearly, it makes no sense to include everything, so naturally some facts can be dropped as long as they do not distort or misrepresent the entire picture. But the facts omitted from the surveyed cases dramatically distort the overall picture. Once these publications were systematically surveyed, it became possible to uncover a clear set of patterns, techniques, and overall methodology that were described in the preceding pages. And here lies the main issue. If it takes considerable effort for someone who specializes on the region to spot and expose the silencing techniques used in reporting on the conflict, then it means that it is nearly impossible to do so for anyone unfamiliar with the issue. Unquote. We are familiar enough with the pattern to know that these techniques will be repeated in academic works published for decades to come. Such work as Azerbaijan and Turkey are engaged in, that is to say, long-term, there you go, so, which is to say long-term deliberate campaigns to disseminate false information or as others have called them, alternative facts. Such work is not the product of ignorance, but rather about the production of ignorance. I've written, and others have written, about denial as a kind of manufacturing of ignorance. Just a few days ago, my wife brought to my attention a great quote in the novel Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, which effectively sums up this process. It's a common sentence that knowledge is power, but who hath duly considered or set forth the power of ignorance? Knowledge slowly builds up what ignorance in an hour pulls down. Knowledge, though patient and frugal centuries, enlarges discovery and makes record of it. Ignorance, wanting its day's dinner, lights a fire with the record and gives a flavor to its one roast with the burnt souls of many generations. So, I beg your forgiveness for having spoken so long and so badly, and for lacking any inspirational words to end this talk. I can only offer the following suggestions. One, and there's only two. One, it is essential that Armenia and Armenians not try to beat Azerbaijan at its own game. That is, if they are going to falsify history and deny reality, then so can we. That is a losing game. It may look necessary, but it's a losing game. Two, as a community, the community of scholars, of activists, of concerned Armenians in the diaspora and in the Republic, we must be more attentive, more vigilant, and not to take seriously the fact that while it is not enough to have truth on our side, we must stand on the side of truth and to speak up and to speak loudly, especially when your voice allows you to. Thank you very much for your time, and for your tolerance and your indulgence.
Marc, do you want me to help? Because I can call on people who
Sure. Come on up, and I'll be the Zoom moderator since I have it on my phone here. I'll first take a question from online. Skipping over the kind words. Would you care to think about what kind of a relationship the U.S. would have or keep having with Azerbaijan in case the Republican candidate, name omitted, were to win the presidency? Well, it wouldn't be good, but I have to say this. The U.S. maintains a warm relationship with Azerbaijan under the current presidency. And as much as I may have my preferences as to who is president, and I do, and as much as former President Trump has a more openly warm bromance with Aliyev going, and vice versa, I can't say really that it's been much different under a Biden presidency in this regard. It hurts to say that, but nonetheless, I think it's probably true. Someone will probably tell me I'm wrong, but that's the way it looks to me. Anyone in the room? While you're thinking. Oh, Henry has a question. Now I'm in trouble. Yeah, please use the microphone and please be kind.
No, I'm going to be very kind. I just wanted to say that was an excellent talk. Your research.
Oh. Now it is.
Hello? Okay. Marc just wanted me to repeat this. That's why I had the mic down. No, it's truly an excellent talk. Incredibly well researched, but also I think your analysis gets at subtleties that even those critical of propaganda often don't get to, and that's part of the reason we don't have sophisticated enough analyses, I think, of propaganda to make an effect. People argue against it and so forth, but you need to do more than that, and you've done more than that, so thank you. So I have no questions.
Thank
just
you.
a comment.
as you know from many, many years of conversation on this topic, I have no interest in arguing with denial, whether it's denial of the Armenian genocide or denial of, whether Armenia exists or whether there are Armenian monuments in Nakhichevan. Having an argument about that just strikes me as an insane waste of valuable time and mental energy. It doesn't follow, therefore, that these arguments can simply be ignored because, unfortunately, again, probably many of us did for many years say, this is crazy, it's just crazy, don't pay any attention to it. Well, here we are. And let me just repeat for those who may have come in slightly late, if you would please come up to the microphone as Tanya is doing to ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, Marc. Wonderful talk, really. A lot of information, very deep research. Thank you. I just was curious, as a layperson, about how Ukraine supports Azerbaijan. That was new. I mean, that was new information I hadn't heard before. I'm not, so I want to know more about it. Thank you.
Yeah, how does Ukraine? I can't answer the how. I can only say that it does. And yes, it is somewhat startling to learn that Ukraine and Russia were two of the largest, or perhaps still are two of the largest arms providers to Azerbaijan. It is extremely dispiriting to watch the videos of those two galas that I showed you pictures of, and many of the participants, a good many of the participants, are from Ukraine and are effusive in expressing their gratitude to President Aliyev for all that he has done for Ukraine. So I don't have a good answer except that they have a relationship, and that part of that relationship involves purchasing weapon systems, and that the purchasing of weapon systems often creates interesting friendships. Yes, David.
Since independence, the diaspora has been left virtually alone in these types of, what you're talking about. It's been left to carry water for work that Armenia itself should be doing. Armenian leadership in Armenia in the past has really, I think most people would agree, it hasn't done a very good job. And now Pashinyan is not doing a very good job at refuting Azeri falsifications. So a lot of it falls on Armenia.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I recognize that Armenia, post-war and post-ethnic cleansing / genocide, is in an exceedingly difficult, precarious position. They have very little, they have no position of strength from which to negotiate. That does not mean, however, that the current behavior and practices are making that situation, which is already bad, any better. I think, in fact, it's probably making it worse. And the rhetoric coming out of Armenia regarding the diaspora seems to be driving a wedge that doesn't need to be driven in. And I don't want to, frankly, contribute to that myself by driving it in from this side of the ocean either. But it's not helpful. Question from online. Artsakh was blockaded for more than 8 months, and more than 120,000 people, including children and elderly, were starved and eventually deported from their ancestral homeland. Doesn't this count as crime against humanity? Yes. It's wonderful when there's an answer. Well, it's not wonderful. It's terrible, actually. But it's an answer that can be given very quickly. Question. Who are the registered foreign agents lobbying for Azerbaijan now, and how might the results of the presidential election affect U.S.-Azeri relations? Part of that has been answered already. I don't have at my mental fingertips the names of the lobbying firms that are currently being employed by Azerbaijan. I do know that they are out there, and some of them are names that are familiar. The late Massachusetts Congressman Delahunt, who is no longer with us, he's dead, that's what I mean, was one of them. That kind of hurt from in the local department. But there are others, and there are plenty of them lined up, and the money is good. And I think that the checks don't bounce. So,
Can I ask you a question?
of course.
So, first of all, thank you, Mark, for this great talk. Learned a lot. I think this talk is very timely because the next episode of reputation laundering will happen in November in Baku when the UN Climate Summit, COP29, is going to take place in Baku, and they're expecting like 60,000 people all over the world to go in Azerbaijan to attend this summit. And just for everyone's awareness, the Zoravik activist collective is organizing a public awareness campaign around this. So if you want to have more information about this, I recommend you go to COP29info, COP29info.com. You'll find more information about this climate summit and all the whitewashing or greenwashing that Azerbaijan is trying to do. So I don't know if you want to say anything about this climate summit and UN's complicity on this.
You're absolutely right, everything you've said. And yeah, I mean, the complicity, the list of complicit actors would require another entire evening just to read off. I would recommend, again, Casey Mitchell's book, Foreign Agents. He does a good job. The book is not primarily about Azerbaijan, I should be clear. It's about other cases, but Azerbaijan is one of the prominent ones. And he does a good job describing the foundational work done 10, 15 years ago when Azerbaijan brought a large contingent of a large congressional delegation to Baku for a lavish, all expenses paid visit that it turned out was being funded by Azeri state dollars as opposed to by U.S. Domestic dollars, and that was therefore illegal. And he tells the complicated story of how that got largely swept under the rug, leading the way, or not necessarily leading the way, but helping pave the way for events such as the climate summit. I mean, the climate summit taking place in one of, in a petro state, I think is A, not a first, unfortunately, and then B, taking place in an autocracy, also not a first. So in that respect, it's business as usual. It hits us maybe more in the solar plexus that it's Azerbaijan rather than fill in the blank, but it's pretty bad either way. Question from online. Is there any evidence of dissident Azerbaijani persons seeking to overcome the Baku state-sponsored denialism? One thinks, by example, of Taner Akçam's pioneering and heroic work countering Turkish denialism. It's a wonderful question. It gives us a sliver of hope, but I'm afraid the answer is no. I was discussing this the other day, that I don't know when we are going to see Azerbaijan's Taner Akçam. It took a long time for Turkey's Taner Akçam to see the light of day, so to speak. There are Azerbaijanis, of course, who oppose the regime. There's no question about that. and many of them are in jail in Azerbaijan. It doesn't necessarily follow that they are supportive or sympathetic to Armenian issues, but at least perhaps there is a potential there. I would like to just share an incident or an anecdote that I was going to include in my talk and cut out because God knows it was long enough already, but I'll try to make this the short version. A few of you were there. In 2007, NAASR had an event on the destruction of the Juha Khachkars with Argam Ayvazyan, Stephen Sim, James Russell. It was a remarkable event. I watched the video of it again recently. You were there, Nancy, you were there, a few other of you were there. And you will, if you were there or have watched the video online, and it's on our YouTube channel, you will remember that at the end of the program, a young man wearing a Harvard t-shirt got up and tried to commandeer the lectern. It turns out he was a young man who was from Baku, or from Azerbaijan, I should say, who was studying at Harvard, and he wanted to counter the propaganda being presented by Ayvazyan, Sim, and Russell. James Russell rather sternly put him in his place. Years went by, and I remembered that young man. In 2011, his name was Bakhtiar Hadjiyev. You can look him up. In 2011, he was imprisoned in Azerbaijan for his opposition to the Aliyev government. In 2012, just prior to the visit of then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to Baku, he was released from prison. And there you can find a photograph online of him with Mrs. Clinton. More years went by. He's in prison again. In 2022, he was arrested. Oh, I should mention that in 2011, when he was in prison, he was beaten, tortured. I'm sorry to have to say that all through these years, to the best of my knowledge, he has continued to make commentary on social media and elsewhere against Armenians. He has not made the logical connection between a government that he is absolutely opposed to and their policy towards Armenians. In late 2022, he was again arrested, beaten, thrown in jail on some trumped-up charges of disturbing the peace or what have you. He undertook a hunger strike, which he eventually ended. But he is still in prison and with more charges and is facing many years in jail. Whether he will ever see the light of day again, I do not know. I wish I could say there was a moral here that I can draw from Bakhtiar Hadjiyev's experience. The Azerbaijani people, in many respects, deserve our sympathy. They live under one of the worst governments in the world. They have been essentially brainwashed, or if you prefer to use my term, gaslighted regarding the Armenians and the history and current state of that region. I'm not suggesting that we all go to Baku and have a group hug. That's not going to happen. But the day will come when the cracks start to appear and people come out who will speak up. There is a Azerbaijani writer named, I believe, Akram Ayishli, or Aylishli, who is also living in Baku effectively under house arrest, even though he's not in jail. He's in his 80s. A decade or so ago, he wrote a book, the name of which, I'm sorry, I cannot remember, but it was a frank book and I believe an honest book about the experience of Armenians living in Azerbaijan. It got him in a lot of trouble, and he's not allowed to leave the country. There's a translation in English. Does anyone remember the title? Stone dreams. Yes. Seek it out. If there's one, there will be two, and eventually there will be others. May we live to see it. Okay, scrolling through. What is the status of POWs in Azerbaijan? This is a bit, in fact, completely beyond the scope of my talk, and I don't have any up-to-date information on the POWs in Azerbaijan, except that they are still being held and that there appears to be no end in sight. There, I believe, was some murmuring about perhaps their being released ahead of the climate summit as some sort of gesture towards public relations, but I don't necessarily expect that to happen. Question: is there an opportunity to use New York Mayor Adams's ties to Azerbaijan to shine light on their caviar diplomacy? I don't know if Adams, someone will correct me please, if he has specifically ties to Azerbaijan so much as to Turkey. Henry, correct me?
Well, I think she was the head of the tourism bureau under his administration was Azeri and was promoting Azerbaijan within, in different events. That's one thing. And I do think there are some other connections. I don't know them offhand, but I encourage people, you can look this up. There's been a tremendous amount of reporting on him and his administration lately. So I think there's more information, but I don't have it in my hand.
It would be unsurprising, given the sort of hand-in-hand relationship between Turkey and Azerbaijan in most matters, if there were not such connections. It is something that the case is being widely reported on in national media. What will come out of that, we'll see. There have been other cases that threatened to sort of blow the lid off things that eventually got covered over again. So how this one will play out, I don't know. Any chance you can get to a microphone, Newton?
Oh.
That would be helpful.
I can speak loud enough.
Okay.
It's interesting that Turkey is part of NATO, but Azerbaijan, who is so closely allied with Turkey, is probably not, but more in the Russian sphere, right?
So the question is about Azerbaijan vis-a-vis Turkey, which is part of NATO, versus Azerbaijan being in the Russian sphere. This is this sort of political alliances are, I guess, above my pay grade. But yes, they seem to be reaping the benefits of both relationships, Azerbaijan, because they are obviously closely, intimately tied to Turkey, but they are also rather closely tied to Russia in the sense of buying weapons from them. How you square that circle is difficult for me to answer, but they are managing it. I guess money goes a long way in this world, but I guess you knew that. Any other questions? Yes, Roger. Roger, I'm going to insist that you go up into the microphone because I know you want the world to hear you.
I'm interested in that. I noticed the University of Utah was mentioned. Is that kind of a stronghold for anti-Armenian, sentiment? And I know that was it Professor Wattenpaugh who was there at University of Utah. Are there other universities that tend to harbor those type of anti-Armenian?
You just trying to get me riled up, Roger? Is that?
I'm riled up already.
Yes, and again, I wouldn't want necessarily to brand an entire university on the basis of one or two scholars or even a department. But yes, for 20 years, Utah has been a hotbed for the production and dissemination of denialist scholarship on the Armenian genocide, and increasingly branching out into Azeri propaganda as well. And as far as I can tell, it is mostly through the efforts of one scholar. Back in the day, and Henry will appreciate this especially, Princeton University also garnered a lot of attention for harboring Turkish denialist scholars, or scholars who supported Turkish denialism. To a certain extent still does, but it's been surpassed, I guess you could say. Scholars have a great thing going for them that is a truly important thing: academic freedom. And everyone should support that. Academic integrity is also important and should also be supported. And I don't know what happens when the two clash with each other. That's something that universities have to work out. Friends, I thank you. And I thank those of you online as well. I encourage you, online or in person, if you have feedback, we like to collect it, especially about these contemporary issues programs, and especially if you have nice things to say. No, but we appreciate your feedback, whether complimentary or not. There are refreshments, there are cookies, there is coffee, and can I mention one last thing? This is important, and I almost let it go. It's Harry Parsekian's birthday. Isn't it? Harry, am I right? Is it your birthday? Today? Can I throw out a number? 39 years old. God bless him. Harry, thank you for sharing your birthday with us. Thank you, everyone, and good night.